The sound cut through the marble hallways like a blade. Sharp, desperate, impossible to ignore. A child's cry, not the kind that begs for food or fusses for attention, but a raw, cyclical sob that came from deep inside the chest. Upstairs in the wing no one dared to enter. That cry grew louder. "Who let him cry like that?" Alexander Kane's voice thundered down the corridor, stopping a maid in her tracks. The clock seemed to pause with him. On the second floor, Ava Morgan froze mid-swipe of a polished window pane, her microfiber cloth still damp in her hand. She'd only been working at Kane Manor for a week, assigned to the East Wing, and explicitly warned never to go near the top floor. Staff whispered about it like it was cursed, but Ava's chest tightened with recognition. She'd heard this sound before. Years ago, when her younger brother, unable to speak, rocked himself into exhaustion. She took one step toward the forbidden staircase. "Miss, stay clear of the upper wing," the butler called from below. She didn't answer. Ava climbed the final steps, each one pulling her deeper into something she couldn't name. At the end of the hallway, a door stood half open, light flickering inside. A boy, maybe 7, sat curled on the carpet, rocking violently, his forehead tapping the edge of a low bookshelf. No adult, no comfort, just pain, looping over itself. Ava stopped at the threshold. Her instincts screamed to turn back, but something older, something buried, kept her rooted. She lowered herself to the floor a few feet away, palms open, voice barely a whisper. "Hey, sweetheart, I'm not going to touch you. I'm just going to sit here." He didn't respond, but the rhythm of his rocking slowed. Barely. She raised one hand and traced a sign across her chest. Safe. Her grandmother had taught it to calm her brother when words failed. For a flicker, the boy's eyes darted to hers. "What the hell are you doing?" She turned sharply. Alexander Kane stood in the doorway, an immovable figure in a tailored suit, fury in his eyes. His hand gripped the doorknob so tightly it looked ready to snap. "I'm sorry, sir," Ava said, rising instinctively. "I heard him crying and—" "Who gave you permission to be in this room?" "No one. I thought he might be in danger." "That's my son," he said coldly. "Step away." She obeyed, until the moment he tried to lift the boy. The child's scream tore through the room, his arms flailing, legs kicking, panic spilling into every corner. "Why is he—" Alexander began. "May I?" Ava asked softly. He hesitated, then almost against his own nature, nodded. She knelt again, and the moment the boy felt her presence, his screams eased. He leaned into her, small hands gripping her sleeve, his face buried against her shoulder as if he'd been waiting for her all along. And in that silence, something in the air shifted. Neither of them knew it yet, but nothing in this house would ever be the same. Alexander Kane didn't say a word for several seconds. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on the small boy, Oliver, now quiet in Ava Morgan's arms. The silence in the room felt heavier than the walls themselves. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier edge. What did you do?" "I didn't do anything, sir," Ava replied softly. "I just listened and signed." "You know sign language?" His brow furrowed. "A little. My younger brother was nonverbal autistic. This used to help him calm down." Alexander's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. The man who'd entered with fury now looked like someone who didn't know where to put his hands. He straightened his cufflinks, as if trying to find his balance. "What's your name?" "Ava Morgan. I clean the East Wing." "You're not a therapist?" "No, sir, just a cleaner." He looked back at Oliver, whose fingers still clung to Ava's sleeve. Then, without warning, Alexander said, "Can you stay a little longer today?" Ava nodded, still swaying gently with the boy in her arms. "Yes, sir." By the time she carried Oliver down to his nursery and settled him on a beanbag with a weighted blanket, the late afternoon sun had turned the windows gold. The boy didn't stir. The quiet that followed wasn't hollow. It was the kind of stillness you wanted to protect. As Ava stepped into the hallway, she expected to be dismissed, maybe even fired, for crossing a line. Instead, she heard his voice again. "Miss Morgan." She turned. Alexander stood at the far end of the corridor, holding a leather-bound notepad. His expression was unreadable. In my office, please. Her stomach tightened. Still, she followed him through double doors into an immaculate study. Dark wood shelves lined with untouched books. Floor-to-ceiling windows looking out onto manicured gardens. At the far end, a desk that could have been carved from a single tree. Sit, he said. She obeyed. For a long moment, he said nothing, just tapped a pen against the edge of the notepad. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock. Then finally, you handled him like you'd done it 100 times. I haven't, not with him. Just with someone like him. Your brother. Yes. He passed away 4 years ago. He was 10. I'm sorry. Thank you. Alexander leaned back in his chair. No therapist, no specialist, no highly paid consultant has been able to calm Oliver like that in 2 years. They all failed. And you just walked in with a cleaning rag and... He stopped himself. Fixed him. I didn't fix him, Ava said. I saw him. There's a difference. Kids like Oliver don't need fixing. They need to be heard. His pen stilled. You sound like someone who should be doing more than mopping floors. I'm someone who needed a job, sir. My grandmother's medical bills aren't going to pay themselves. Alexander closed the notepad. I want to make you an offer. I need someone Oliver trusts, not a clipboard-carrying stranger. You. I'm not a nanny. I don't need a nanny. I need you. Ava hesitated, the weight of her brother's memory pressing on her chest. I don't know if I can... I'll double your pay. Private room in the staff wing, weekends off, health insurance, and you'll never pick up a mop again. She exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about money. It was about a boy who had chosen her, and she knew what betrayal would look like if she left. When would I start? Tomorrow morning, Alexander said, and just like that, everything changed. Then she picked up a stray passenger car and rolled it toward him. He glanced at it, then at her, and, without a word, connected it to the engine. From the doorway, Alexander watched. He was dressed more casually than Ava had ever seen him. White shirt with the sleeves rolled, no tie. He stepped inside, his eyes fixed on his son. He used to love trains, he said quietly. My wife, Emma, would take him to the Railroad Museum every other Saturday. Ava's gaze shifted to him. He hasn't asked to go since she passed. Alexander shook his head. Not once. His voice was even, but his jaw tightened. After the funeral, I hired the best therapist money could buy. Enrolled him in every specialized program. I spared no expense. But it only got worse. The tantrums, the fear of strangers, the screaming. Ava hesitated, then said, Grief doesn't follow a straight path, Mr. Kane. Not for you. Not for him. He was silent for a long moment, watching Oliver push the train slowly around the bend. Do you think he remembers her? I think he feels her absence, Ava answered, even if he doesn't have the words. Alexander sat on the floor beside his son, carefully as though afraid to break the moment. Hey, buddy, he murmured. Oliver didn't recoil. He didn't flinch. He simply kept moving the train, but his small hand brushed Alexander's knee in passing. Ava caught the flicker of surprise in Alexander's eyes. That's him talking, she said softly. You just have to learn to listen to the version of language he trusts. Later that evening, Ava returned to her room in the staff wing. She placed her grandmother's photo on the desk and traced the frame with her fingertips. Loretta had always told her, Baby, sometimes the quietest things speak the loudest. There was a knock at her door. Mrs. Green stood there with a tray of grilled salmon, roasted sweet potatoes, and green beans. Mr. Kane says you skipped dinner, she said. Ava blinked. I didn't notice. Apparently neither did the boy. Miracle of miracles. As Ava ate alone, her mind drifted back to the image of Alexander sitting on the floor beside Oliver. Not as a millionaire. The next morning, Ava arrived at the nursery at 8:30 sharp. Oliver was sitting by the window, tracing shapes into the condensation on the glass with one finger. The soft morning light spilled across the carpet, warming the cool air. Morning, Oliver, she said gently, taking her usual slow steps toward him. He didn't turn, but he didn't stiffen either. That was progress. Ava sat down beside him, not too close, and reached into her tote. I thought we could try something new today. She pulled out a small whiteboard and a dry erase marker. First, she drew a simple sun, then a cloud. She handed the marker to Oliver without a word. He stared at it for a long time, then took it slowly and drew a crooked heart. Ava smiled, her throat tightening. That's perfect. From the hallway, Alexander stood just outside the door, watching. His hand hovered over the doorknob but didn't push it open. Something in his chest shifted, like an old hinge learning to move again. That night, Alexander sat in his study with a glass of whiskey he didn't drink. On the desk lay a thin file, Ava's employment record. A handwritten reference letter from her old diner manager caught his eye. She's not fancy, but she shows up early, works late, and never complains. She's kind, and she knows how to listen even when people don't know how to talk. He read it twice before closing the folder. By the second week, Alexander had stopped watching from the doorway. He began stepping into the nursery, kneeling on the rug beside Oliver, mimicking Ava's hand signs. His movements were clumsy, but his effort was real. One morning, Ava signed cow, shaping her hands into horns. Oliver didn't copy, but he reached for a small wooden cow and pressed it into the kinetic sand. Alexander chuckled quietly. He's getting it, Alexander said. So are you, Ava replied with a smile. That afternoon, Alexander surprised her with an invitation. After lunch, walk with me in the garden? She hesitated, unsure if this crossed the line between professional and personal, but nodded. The spring air was cool and fragrant as they strolled past blooming hedges toward the old gazebo. His therapist called this morning, Alexander said as they walked. She noted significant behavioral improvements, said he's beginning to trust again. That's more than therapy, Ava said softly. That's safety. Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her. She asked what changed in the home environment. And what did you say? I told her it was you. Ava let out a quiet laugh, brushing a braid behind her ear. I'm just part of it. You're the part that matters. For a moment, they simply stood there, the garden alive around them, but the space between them still. Then Alexander spoke again, his voice lower. Before Emma died, she said I was always 2 steps behind, that I didn't see what was in front of me until it was too late. Ava didn't rush to fill the silence. When she got sick, I panicked. I tried to control everything, as if structure could replace her presence. Grief makes us grasp for anything that doesn't move, Ava said quietly, because what moves might disappear. He looked at her sharply as though surprised she understood. Then slowly he nodded. They continued walking, the camellias blooming stubbornly around them, their petals opening on their own time, just like Oliver. That evening the house was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty but full, like the walls were listening. Ava was in the study, seated at Alexander's desk with a laptop open. Beside her lay a thick binder he'd found in the back of a closet. Emma filmed everything, Alexander had explained earlier, handing her a small USB drive. Therapy sessions, milestones, even the bad days. She said one day we'd forget the hard parts and miss the details, so we should save them. Ava clicked on the first video. On the screen, a much younger Oliver, maybe 4, sat at a low table with a therapist, stacking blocks. Emma's voice floated in from behind the camera, warm and patient. Good job, sweetheart. Now show Daddy the sign for love. The boy turned toward the lens, his small hands clumsily shaping the word. Emma laughed softly. That's your daddy, baby. Well done. Ava watched in stillness, feeling the echo of that moment ripple through the room. When she turned slightly in her chair, she saw Alexander in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his usual armor of pressed suits and guarded expressions. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the screen. I forgot about that video, he said quietly. I haven't watched them since before the funeral. She was good with him, Ava said. She was everything, he replied, his voice breaking just enough to make the words ache. And I erased her, or tried to. Ava rose from the chair and walked to him slowly. No, you didn't. You were surviving. Sometimes surviving means breaking open in silence. He looked at her for a long moment. Is that what I've been doing? Yes, but now you're healing. And you? He asked, his voice softer now. Ava hesitated, her mind flicking to the memory of her brother's last days. Some days, yes. Some days, less so. The air between them shifted, not heavy with grief, but with something unspoken. Gently, Alexander reached out and touched her hand. She didn't pull away. That night, Ava lay in bed unable to sleep. Her heart beat fast, not from fear, but from awareness that something was changing in this house, between the three of them. Not love, not yet, but something deeper than convenience. The next morning began with an unexpected sound, soft humming from the kitchen. When Ava walked in, she found Alexander at the stove, sleeves rolled, making French toast while Oliver sat at the counter in his pajamas. "I thought I'd surprise him," Alexander said, flipping a slice. Ava smiled faintly. "Edges a little crispy. That's how he likes them." Alexander glanced at her with a small, almost shy smile. "You always remember the details." "Details are where the heart lives," she said without thinking. They ate together. No rush, no tension. Just a father, a boy, and the woman who had somehow bridged the gap between them. When Oliver reached across the table to place a blueberry on Ava's plate, Alexander caught her eye. No words passed, but she could read the thought in his gaze. He's trusting again. And for the first time in years, Alexander Kane allowed himself to believe that trust, once lost, could grow back. 3 weeks into her new role, Ava Morgan had built a rhythm in the Kane manner that no therapist or specialist had managed in 2 years. Mornings began the same way, soft light spilling through the nursery windows. Oliver on the rug surrounded by tactile toys, and Ava seated a few feet away, patient as the clock. That day she introduced something new, a soft mat, scented modeling clay, and a stack of laminated cards, each with a cartoon face showing a different emotion. "This one's happy," she said, showing the first card. "Happy like when the music plays." Oliver studied it, then touched the card with his fingertips and pressed it against his chest. "Yeah," Ava whispered. "That's right." By the time Alexander returned from a meeting, the air in the house felt different. In the kitchen, Mrs. Green had jazz playing low from her tablet. Upstairs, a sound stopped him mid-step. Not crying, not silence, but a short, airy giggle. He followed it to the living room. Ava was kneeling on the carpet, a toy giraffe in one hand, a sock puppet on the other. Oliver sat cross-legged in front of her, watching as the giraffe and the puppet argued over a pretend cup of tea. When the puppet tipped over with an exaggerated oof, Oliver's face broke into a full smile. No sound came out, but the light in his eyes was undeniable. "Was that him laughing?" Alexander asked from the doorway. Ava straightened, brushing lint from her slacks. "Sort of. No sound yet, but it's close." Alexander crouched beside his son. "Hey, buddy." Oliver didn't retreat. In fact, he reached out and touched his father's shirt briefly before returning to the toys. "He's trusting you more," Ava said softly. Alexander didn't look away from Oliver. He used to play like this with Emma. She had this ridiculous sock puppet voice, and he loved it. There was a pause, then he looked up at Ava. "Thank you." "I'm not doing anything you couldn't do," she replied. "That," he said, half smiling, "is the part I find hard to believe." Later that evening, Ava took her mug of tea out to the garden, settling onto the bench beneath the magnolia tree. The spring night was cool, the scent of blossoms carrying on the breeze. She often came here to breathe, to let the day settle in her bones. The garden gate creaked, and Alexander stepped into the moonlight, holding 2 mugs. "Thought you might like chamomile," he said. "That's thoughtful," she replied. They sat side by side, not too close. For a while, there was only the sound of wind through the branches. "I've been meaning to ask," he began. "Your brother, what happened?" Ava's eyes lowered. "Seizure. Complications from an infection. He was 10. Passed in the hospital while I was filling out paperwork for insurance." "I'm sorry," Alexander said quietly. "He was the only one who saw me without expecting anything back," she said. Alexander glanced toward the lit windows of the house. "That sounds like Oliver." Ava smiled faintly. "It does." He leaned back, exhaling. "You make this look easy, but I know it's not. I know I can be difficult, and this house can be cold." "You're not difficult," Ava replied. You're grieving in the only way you know how. His eyes met hers. Call me Alexander. She hesitated, then nodded. All right, Alexander. And in the quiet that followed, something between them took root. Not fast, not forced, but real. The following afternoon, Ava led a small lesson in the sunroom. Oliver sat cross-legged on the soft mat, while she showed him simple sign language. More, stop, help, love. Alexander joined them, kneeling on the other side of his son. His fingers moved clumsily at first, but his focus never wavered. When Alexander signed more, Oliver hesitated, then responded with his own small, half-formed version of the gesture. Alexander's breath caught. He didn't say a word, just smiled and reached for his son's hand. That evening, Ava sat in her room, writing in her journal. She had barely finished noting the day's breakthrough when a soft knock came. Alexander stood in the doorway holding a book. I found this in Emma's things, he said. It's about parenting children with sensory disorders. Thought we could read it together. Ava took it carefully. I'd like that. He lingered a moment before adding, thank you for staying. By early summer, their mornings had settled into a new routine. Sensory play before breakfast, then quiet activities that allowed Oliver to lead. That day, Ava brought out a set of animal-shaped molds and a tray of kinetic sand. Cow, she signed, forming horns with her fingers. Oliver didn't mimic her hands, but he pointed to the small cow figurine and pressed it into the sand with surprising care. He's getting it, Alexander said, watching from the rug. So are you, Ava replied. After lunch, Alexander suggested a walk through the garden. Oliver had fallen asleep in the sunroom, the stuffed bear clutched in his arms. Ava hesitated, unsure if this was crossing into personal territory, but followed him past the hedges to the old gazebo. His therapist called this morning, Alexander began. She noted real progress, said he's starting to trust again. That's more than therapy, Ava said. That's feeling safe. Alexander stopped and turned toward her. She asked what changed here. I told her it was you. Ava laughed softly, brushing a braid behind her ear. I'm just one part. You're the part that matters, he said without hesitation. They walked in silence for a while, until Alexander spoke again. Before Emma died, she said I was always 2 steps behind, that I didn't see what was in front of me until it was too late. When she got sick, I thought control could save her. Structure, schedules, but it couldn't. Grief makes us hold on to what doesn't move, Ava said quietly, because what moves might disappear. He looked at her like she'd just said something he'd been trying to name for years. Slowly, he nodded. They reached a camellia bush in full bloom. Ava brushed her fingers across a pink petal. My grandmother grew these on her porch. She said they bloomed when they felt like it, not when people expected. Alexander smiled faintly. Sounds familiar. That evening, they reviewed the old therapy binder together, watching videos Emma had recorded. In one, a tiny Oliver signed love for the first time. Emma's laughter filled the speakers. Alexander's voice cracked. She was everything. Ava met his gaze. You didn't erase her. You were surviving. Now, you're finding your way back. And in the quiet that followed, neither moved, but something between them did. The next morning, the rhythm of the house was broken by an unexpected sound. 3 hard knocks on the front door. Not the polite rap of a visitor, but the sharp, echoing kind that made the air tighten. Ava was in the kitchen, stirring Oliver's oatmeal, when she heard it. Moments later, Alexander appeared, his brow already creased. Standing on the front step was a man in a tailored gray suit, clipboard tucked under one arm. 2 others flanked him, one in business casual, the other with an earpiece. The insignia on the clipboard read, Child Welfare Services. Mr. Kane? The man asked, voice firm but measured. Yes, Alexander replied slowly. What's this about? I'm Marcus Fielding. We've received a report of possible neglect involving your son, Oliver Kane. We're here for an assessment. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the wind whispering through the hedges. Ava stepped into the hallway. Oliver balanced on her hip. His small hands gripped her blouse tighter, his pulse racing against her. This is absurd, Alexander said, his voice dangerously calm. Who filed this report? I'm afraid we can't disclose the source during the initial visit, Marcus replied. May we come in? No, Alexander said flatly. Not until I speak with my attorney. You have every right to contact legal counsel, Marcus said evenly. But if you deny entry during a welfare check, we may have to escalate to a court order. Ava's voice was steady when she spoke. He's safe. I'm with him every day. There's no neglect here. Marcus's gaze shifted to her. And you are? Ava Morgan. I'm his full-time caregiver. Another agent scribbled notes. Alexander exhaled, sharp through his nose. Give me 5 minutes. He returned inside, making 2 quick calls. One to his attorney, the other to a private security contact. When he came back, his tone was clipped. You may enter, but under observation, and you will not touch anything without consent. They moved through the house with quiet efficiency, checking the nursery, the kitchen, the pantry, even the backyard. One agent asked to speak to Oliver alone. No, Ava said immediately. He doesn't speak with strangers. He has autism. I'm his voice when he needs one. Marcus nodded, jotting it down. 20 minutes later, they left. Nothing to find. No case to make. But before stepping out, Marcus paused. Off the record, he said to Alexander, it's rare to see a child this well cared for. Whoever sent the complaint may have had other motivations. When the door closed, Alexander's jaw tightened. Someone's trying to get to us, he said. Ava shifted Oliver on her hip. I think I know who. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't need to. The same name sat heavy on both their minds. Later that afternoon in Alexander's office, the players gathered. Ava, his attorney Sandra Griffin, and Lionel Hatch, a silver-haired security advisor. This wasn't random, Alexander began. We've been facing resistance on the upcoming acquisition. Now this. Lionel nodded. We'll start with a full sweep, find the leak, and when we do, we'll make sure they don't try this again. Ava met Alexander's eyes across the table. I'm not going anywhere, she said quietly. He didn't reply with words, just held her gaze, steady as a promise. The courtroom felt colder than it should have been, the kind of chill that seeps past your clothes and into your bones. Ava sat beside Alexander at the defense table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Around them, the gallery buzzed with whispered speculation. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a public reckoning. Judge Monroe, a woman whose silver hair was pulled into a flawless knot, entered with quiet authority. This court will now hear Kane Industries versus Lark Technologies, she announced. On the opposing side, Sylvia Warner sat in the front row, her engagement ring catching the light. She didn't look at Ava, not directly, but the smirk at the corner of her mouth said enough. The first testimonies came and went, all circling the same story. The leaked schedules, the false welfare report, the attempted corporate sabotage. Lionel Hatch's testimony laid the facts bare. Sylvia's access, her connection to Lark, and the trail she'd left behind. But the room didn't truly shift until Ava's name was called. She rose, walked to the stand, and took her oath. Under questioning, she spoke simply and without theatrics. She told them about finding Oliver alone that first day, about using sign language when words failed, about the night strangers walked into the house and Oliver's terror filled the air. And did Mr. Kane instruct you to intervene in matters beyond your position? The opposing attorney asked, his tone heavy with condescension. No, Ava said. I chose to, because that boy wasn't just frightened, he was forgotten, and I know what that feels like. The room went still. Judge Monroe studied her for a moment before saying, Thank you, Miss Morgan. You may step down. Hours later, the verdict came. Case dismissed with prejudice. But it was the judge's closing remarks that stayed with everyone. This court finds the actions of Miss Morgan to reflect the highest moral standard, one we would do well to emulate. Outside, the press swarmed. Questions flew, cameras flashed. Ava didn't linger. She returned to Kane Manor, where Oliver was waiting in the sunroom. He looked up at her, eyes searching, then signed one word, safe. She knelt beside him. Yes, she signed back. We're safe. Later, Alexander found her in the garden. You didn't just help him, he said. You saved him. Ava shook her head. We saved each other. Because that's the truth of it. Sometimes the most powerful change comes from simply showing up, refusing to leave, and believing that even the quietest voices deserve to be heard. If this story touched your heart, Let it remind you that you don't have to be wealthy or powerful to make a difference. You just have to care enough to stay. And if you believe stories like this matter, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe so you'll be here for the next journey we take together. Because there are more lives, more battles, and more quiet victories still waiting to be told.